They said she was reckless, too quiet to command, and too young to know better. But that was before the night they found her inside the Abrams, hands steady on the controls when everyone else had already scattered. If you agree that courage isn't about strikes on your shoulder, but about what you do when fear takes hold, make sure to like and subscribe, because this is a story you will never forget. It didn't begin with the roar of the M1's engine, though. It began in silence, on a training field littered with smoke grenades and overturned mock barricades, where Lieutenant Marissa Cole, just 28, with a chest full of doubt that wasn't hers but given to her by others, stood waiting for orders that never seemed to make sense. The captain had already called retreat, his voice cracking through the radio with the sharp edge of panic disguised as protocol, and soldiers who just moments ago stood ready to fight now stumbled back toward the ridge line, their boots pounding against the dirt as if the enemy armor, rolling forward, were more than just a simulation. Cole didn't move. She had been overlooked before, shoved into logistics briefings because her frame was slight and her voice measured instead of booming, told to leave the armor work to the real soldiers. Even though her earliest memories weren't of dolls or textbooks, but of engine oil under her nails and her father's calloused hands guiding hers over the bolts and switches of a tank he swore she would one day command. He had been a tanker in the Gulf War, and before he died, he made her promise to know the Abrams like it was her own heartbeat. So when the captain's order echoed again, retreat, 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 she looked at the smoke drifting low across the valley, and she remembered his words. Fear makes men loud. Courage makes them steady. Around her, the platoon's whispers grew into laughter, half nervous, half scornful. She doesn't belong here, one muttered, yanking his pack tighter. Bet she's still thinking about spreadsheets. Another sneered, their mocking jabs hidden under the rush of boots pounding away from the line. Cole didn't answer. She rarely did. Her silence was its own language, one people misread as weakness, but that in truth was the way she measured moments. Waited, calculated, breathed through the storm until it was time to move. She adjusted her helmet, eyes cutting across the smoke where hulking silhouettes loomed, and in that moment, she noticed what no one else had. The enemy armor, massive as it appeared, was bottlenecking at a narrow choke point, a mistake any tanker worth their salt would exploit. But no one else had seen it. The captain's voice cracked louder. Pull back. That's an order. And the platoon obeyed because they didn't know how not to. Cole exhaled, the radio still hissing in her ear, her fingers brushing the Abrams beside her like it was more than steel, more than war games. It was memory, it was inheritance, it was promise. She climbed onto the hull, the laughter still echoing behind her, the dismissals ringing louder than gunfire. And she remembered being 13 years old, sitting on the garage floor beside her father while he showed her the schematic diagrams he kept folded in his wallet, telling her that machines never cared about doubt. They only cared if you knew how to handle them. She slid into the commander's hatch, the weight of the seat familiar, almost familial, her hands closing around controls that felt like home. The engine wasn't alive yet, but in her mind she could already hear it, that thunderous growl that silenced everything else. Outside, the captain shouted again, his voice climbing in desperation, but Cole's hands were already moving, her breath steady, her decision made. She wasn't defying orders. She was stepping into the moment the way she had always been taught. When retreat was chaos, someone had to call courage. And even though no one watching from the ridge believed she belonged there, even though the last words muttered about her were that she should stay behind her desk, Cole was about to remind them all that war doesn't care about titles, or genders, or loud voices. It cares about steadiness in the storm, about who climbs into the seat when everyone else has abandoned it. And for the first time that night, the battlefield grew quiet, not because the mock tanks had stopped rolling, but because a soldier the captain had written off was about to make the ground tremble. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life beneath her, a sound so deep it shook the dirt, and sent a vibration through her chest like a second heartbeat. And for a brief moment, every soldier who had been retreating turned their heads back in disbelief, because no one thought Lieutenant Marissa Cole had the guts to climb into the Abrams, let alone bring it to life in the middle of chaos. They thought she would stand on the ridge, maybe take notes, maybe shuffle her papers, but not this. Never this. And yet here she was, helmet shadowing her eyes, voice calm as she keyed into the intercom. "Driver, button up." Though she was both commander and crew, alone in a machine meant for four, and still she moved like she had been born there, switching systems on with a precision that came not from training manuals, but from years of watching her father trace his fingers across diagrams and say, "This is how you breathe with steel." Outside, the captain's voice cracked over the net, high-pitched and frantic. "Cool, shut that down. That's an order. You're going to get yourself killed." But the soldiers on the ridge, the same ones who mocked her 10 minutes earlier, now stood frozen, their retreat stuttering into silence as the Abrams lurched forward, smoke curling off its exhaust like the breath of some ancient beast roused from slumber. Cole didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge the radio. She only watched the silhouettes ahead, freeze-simulated enemy, tanks cresting the hill in perfect arrogance, their formation tight but funneled. Through the choke point she had spotted, their arrogance as loud as her captain's fear, and with one hand on the turret controls she pivoted the gun, every motion steady, deliberate, remembering her father's voice when he taught her to align crosshairs on a soda can at 50 yards. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. The Abrams shook as she fired, the training round screaming through the night, and striking the lead vehicle with a thunderous crack that echoed across the valley. And though it was just a simulation, the effect was devastating. Alarms blared, one of the enemy tanks ground to a halt, and in that instant the battlefield belonged to her. The captain shouted again, his panic laced with humiliation now. "Cole, you're compromising the exercise." But his words were drowned out by the second round slamming into another silhouette, the steel beast beneath her roaring louder with each breath, and the soldiers who had been halfway up the ridgeline stopped, wide-eyed, their boots sinking into the dirt as they turned to watch the quiet lieutenant they had dismissed burn down an armored advance single-handedly. For the first time all night, no one laughed. Cole's eyes narrowed as she swung the turret again, targeting the last tank pushing through the choke point, her breath steady, her voice barely above a whisper as she said into the empty crew headset, "Not today." The round left the barrel, smoke curling upward in its wake, and when the last simulated target was reduced to glowing debris on the monitors overhead, silence rippled across the training field, thicker than any smoke, heavier than any order. She powered down slowly, deliberately, her hand resting on the console as though to honor it. Then she climbed out of the hatch, her boots striking steel with the certainty of someone who knew she didn't need applause. Behind her, the captain stood red-faced, sputtering into his headset, trying to spin what had just happened in a protocol. But even his words seemed smaller now, thinner, because everyone else's eyes weren't on him. They were on Cole, the lieutenant who had turned retreat into victory with nothing but steady hands and an engine they thought she couldn't handle. A corporal muttered under his breath, not even realizing the net was open. She just did what 3 of us couldn't. And the truth hung there in the silence, undeniable. Cole scanned the field, her face unreadable, but inside she felt her father's presence as clear as the stars above. The man who once told her that courage wasn't about shouting over fear, it was about being the one who still moved when everyone else stopped. And now, as the dust settled and soldiers stood straighter without realizing why, she knew that for the first time since donning her uniform, they were beginning to see her not as the desk officer, not as the young woman who didn't belong, but as the one who stepped up when even the captain had stepped back. The dust had barely settled when the silence broke, not with applause or cheers, but with the quiet shuffle of boots as soldiers who had almost fled now drifted back toward the tank, their eyes fixed not on the wrecked silhouettes of the mock enemy, but on the lieutenant who stood atop the Abrams as though she had been carved there by history itself, her frame steady, her expression unreadable, and the captain, red-faced and sweating, tried to bark something about unauthorized engagement, but his voice carried no weight now, not after the men had seen what they saw, not after they felt the ground tremble beneath a single officer who refused to obey fear. Cole climbed down slowly, not in triumph, but in the measured way her father had always taught her, because dignity didn't sprint. It walked steady, and when her boots touched the earth again, the first to step forward was not the captain, but a young private, barely out of basic, who had been one of the loudest to mock her earlier. His voice breaking as he said almost in awe, "Ma'am, you saved us." Though it wasn't real combat, Though it was just an exercise, the weight of the moment made every word ring as though they had lived it. Cole didn't answer, only nodded once, her silence commanding more respect than 100 speeches could, and that was when headlights cut across the ridge, a black SUV pulling into the training grounds, the kind of vehicle that made even seasoned officers stiffen because it never arrived. Without reason, and from its stepped a figure no one expected at a midnight exercise. General Nathan Harland, broad-shouldered, crisp in his uniform despite the hour, his stars gleaming under the floodlights as he walked with the deliberate stride of someone who already knew what had happened, because men like him always knew when lines had been crossed and when new ones had been drawn. The captain rushed forward, stammering excuses about protocols and reckless behavior, trying to spin his panic into authority, but Harland brushed him aside with a glance colder than steel, his eyes finding Cole where she stood by the Abrams, her helmet tucked under one arm, her other hand resting lightly on the tank as though it were more than machinery, as though it were kin. "Lieutenant Cole," the general said, his voice deep, steady, the kind that rolled across a field without effort. And for a moment the entire platoon held its breath, because no one knew if this was going to be condemnation or something far heavier. "Who authorized you to engage?" Cole's voice was even, respectful but unflinching. "No one, sir. But I couldn't retreat." A pause stretched long in the night, the kind that decides futures, and then Harlan's face softened, just barely, as he stepped closer, his voice dropping lower but carrying to every ear nonetheless. "I served with a man once, a tanker who carried his crew out of a burning desert under fire because he refused to retreat. His name was Cole too." Marissa's breath caught, just for a fraction, because she knew exactly who he meant, and the general saw it in her eyes before nodding once, firmly. "Your father taught half of us what steel and courage really meant. Tonight, you reminded me he wasn't alone in that." The platoon shifted, unease mingling with realization, the whispers starting even before Harland turned his gaze back on the captain. "You called retreat," he said flatly. "And in doing so, you surrendered not just the exercise, but every ounce of trust your men placed in you. You're relieved." The captain's face drained of color, his protest swallowed by the weight of a truth no one in the field would dispute now, and Harland didn't give him another glance, instead gesturing to Cole. "Lieutenant, you will conduct the after-action review. I want every soldier on this ground to hear not just what you did, but why you did it." Cole stiffened, not out of fear but out of the sudden enormity of it. Yet she nodded, climbing onto the back deck of the Abrams worthy. Floodlights framed her in stark brilliance, and when she spoke it wasn't with the booming bark of a career officer, but with the quiet steadiness that carried more weight because it came from conviction, not volume. "Courage," she began, her voice calm but clear, "isn't about ignoring fear. It's about knowing when fear is lying to you. Retreat wasn't safety tonight, it was surrender, and surrendering without trying meant abandoning each other." She let the silence stretch, the soldiers leaning in without realizing they were doing it, the captain glaring from the shadows with the ruined look of a man stripped of his armor. "I didn't climb into the Abrams because I wanted glory," she continued, her tone sharpening with the honesty of someone who had nothing to prove. "I did it because if someone didn't stand, all of us would fall. That's what my father taught me, and that's what I'll teach anyone who serves beside me. Leadership isn't loud. It's steady, and it never leaves anyone behind." For a long moment after she finished, the field was silent except for the hum of the cooling Abrams engine. Then slowly, almost tentatively, one soldier straightened and saluted, then another, and then the whole platoon until the ridge was lined with hands raised in respect, not demanded but earned in fire, and Cole returned it, her throat tight though her face remained composed, because this wasn't about her. It was about the promise she carried forward from a man who had once told her she would command steel and men alike. Harlan stepped forward again, his voice softer now, but filled with something no one had heard from him in years, pride. "From this day forward," he said, "no one in this division forgets the name Cole, not because of who your father was, but because of who you are." And with that, the exercise ended, but its echoes did not. In the weeks that followed, word of what happened at Fort Ridge spread quietly through mess halls and barracks, always beginning with the same sentence. The captain had called retreat, until she took over the Abrams, And in every retelling, the laughter about her spreadsheets and her silence faded further into memory, replaced by a respect that grew heavier with time. Some called it legend. Others just called it truth. And years later, when new cadets arrived, wide-eyed and unsure, they were told to walk past the Abrams parked at the base's front gate, its paint gleaming, its plaque reading, in honor of Lieutenant Marissa Cole, who showed us that steel obeys courage, not fear. Cole herself never spoke much of that night. She didn't need to. Her actions had carved themselves into the soil, into the silence, into the legacy of every soldier who stood taller because she refused to step back. And though she never said it aloud, those who knew her best understood the lesson she had carried from her father into the fire and out again. Fear shouts, retreat echoes, but courage is the only voice that stays.